The Sikorsky R-5's rotor blades carved through alpine air at 270 RPM 40 revolutions, slower than the specifications promised. Major Jack Brennan felt every one of those missing rotations through his boots, through his seat, through the cyclic stick vibrating in his right hand. The Warner Super Scarab engine, all 180 horses of it, screamed behind him a banshee wail that echoed off the vertical granite walls of the Stubai Alps, closing in on both sides. Below, through the bubble canopy, that greenhouse of vulnerability that gave him 360 degrees of sight and 360 degrees of exposure, he could see them. 4 men. American OSS agents, stranded at 10,000 feet on a glacier that wasn't supposed to exist on any map, waving frantically with whatever they could find, a parachute silk, a signal mirror catching the dying March sunlight. The fuel gauge read 23 minutes. The nearest Allied position, the emergency landing strip they'd scraped out of an Italian valley, sat 38 minutes away. And somewhere behind him, climbing through the mountain passes, a Gestapo patrol was closing in. He'd seen their vehicles on the approach, dark dots winding up the access roads like ants converging on sugar. This machine wasn't supposed to be here. These mountains weren't supposed to allow rotary wing flight, the updrafts, the downdrafts, the razor winds that could flip a helicopter like a playing card. This mission wasn't supposed to happen at all. But March 17th, 1945, 12 miles inside Nazi Austria, 37 miles from Innsbruck, Major Jack Brennan was about to attempt something that would either prove helicopters could change warfare forever, or prove they were death traps that never should have left the experimental hangar. The collective pitch lever felt like it was fighting him. Every inch of altitude he gained cost him fuel he didn't have. The rotor disc, that invisible spinning plate above his head that was the only thing keeping 2 tons of metal and fuel and flesh from becoming a crater, was tilting at angles that made his gut clench. He keyed the throat microphone. "Green up, survivors. This is Angel 1. I've got visual. Prepare for extraction. You got 90 seconds to reach my landing zone or I'm leaving you behind." The response crackled back, breathless, desperate. "Angel 1, we're not all here. We're missing." The transmission cut off. And that's when Brennan saw the second group. Another 300 yards up the glacier. 2 more figures, 1 crawling, 1 dragging him. 6 men total. His R-5 was certified for a pilot and 2 passengers. 3 people maximum, 750 pounds total capacity. The men below, 6 of them probably weighed 1,400 pounds combined, nearly double the limit. The math wasn't just bad, the math was suicidal. But 36 hours earlier, those 6 men had been parachuted into these mountains carrying intelligence that could collapse the entire Nazi defensive line in Austria. Intelligence that could save 10,000 American lives when Patton's Third Army crossed the border. If Brennan left them, the Gestapo would have them in 2 hours, torture them in 4, execute them by dawn. If Brennan tried to save them, the helicopter would probably fail during takeoff. The overloaded rotor system would stall. The engine would quit. They'd cartwheel down the glacier and explode. He pushed the cyclic forward. The helicopter translated toward the glacier. His hand moved to the collective, beginning the descent that would either make history or become another unmarked grave in the Alps that no one would find until the glaciers melted 70 years later. To understand how a helicopter ended up in Nazi Austria attempting an impossible rescue, you have to understand 3 things. First, what a helicopter actually was in 1945. Picture the least reliable, most terrifying aircraft ever conceived. Take an airplane, remove the wings, the one thing that makes fixed-wing flight predictable. Replace them with spinning blades that generate lift through principles most pilots couldn't explain. Add vibrations that loosen bolts mid-flight, install an engine barely powerful enough to lift the machine's own weight, and close the pilot in a plastic bubble that offered the same protection as a greenhouse. Now fly that contraption through mountain passes at 10,000 feet, where the air is thin enough that every component is operating at the bleeding edge of failure. That was the Sikorsky R-5, the most advanced helicopter in the American arsenal, and advanced is doing a lot of work in that sentence. Igor Sikorsky's VS-300, the grandfather of all modern helicopters, had first flown in 1939, just 6 years earlier. By April 1944, his R-4 had performed the first military helicopter rescue in history. Lieutenant Carter Harmon, 1st Air Commando Group, flying into the jungles of Burma, behind Japanese lines, 500 miles of hostile territory, rescued 3 wounded British commandos and a downed American pilot from a clearing so small that no fixed-wing aircraft could reach them. The mission took 2 days. The helicopter broke down 3 times. Harmon had to land, repair the machine with spare parts tied to the exterior, then take off again. But it worked. And that single mission, that impossible mission, proved that helicopters could do what no airplane could ever accomplish: land anywhere, hover in place, extract personnel from terrain that should have been unreachable. The R-5, introduced in late 1944, was the evolution. Bigger, slightly more reliable, with a range of 360 miles and a ceiling of 14,000 feet, theoretically. By March 1945, fewer than 100 R-5 helicopters existed in the entire U.S. military. They were experimental, fragile, unproven outside of controlled conditions. Which brings us to the second thing you need to understand: Operation Greenup. In February 1945, the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, America's wartime intelligence agency and the direct ancestor of the CIA, conceived an operation so audacious that most of the planners thought it was a fantasy. Parachute a team of agents into Nazi-controlled Austria, not just into Austria, into the Stubai Alps, at over 10,000 feet of elevation in the dead of winter, onto a glacier surrounded by Wehrmacht positions. Their mission: gather intelligence on German troop movements through the Brenner Pass, the critical supply line connecting Germany to Italy. Identify defensive positions, locate ammunition depots, radio the information back to Allied command. If successful, the intelligence could allow American forces to bypass the Nazi defensive line entirely. If captured, the agents would be tortured for information, then executed. The actual Operation Greenup team, Friedrich Mayer, Hans Winberg, and Franz Weber, jumped into Austria on the night of February 26, 1945. They weren't supposed to be rescued by helicopter. They weren't supposed to be rescued at all. But here's the third thing, the piece of the story that was classified for 50 years. There was a second team, a parallel operation, codenamed Greenup Shadow, that the OSS launched 2 weeks after the main drop. 4 agents, different insertion point, higher up the valley. Their mission: establish a radio relay station in the mountains to amplify signals from the main team. The Alps were disrupting communication. Greenup Shadow was supposed to fix that, but their drop went wrong. High winds scattered the team across 3 kilometers of glacier. One agent broke his leg on landing. Another twisted his ankle badly enough that he couldn't walk without support. Their radio equipment, packed in a separate container, fell into a crevasse and was irretrievable. By March 15th, the Greenup Shadow team was stranded, unable to hike out, unable to call for help, running low on food and medical supplies. And through sheer bad luck, a Gestapo mountain patrol spotted their abandoned parachutes. The net was closing. Someone in OSS headquarters in Bari, Italy, looked at a map of the Alps, looked at the weather reports, looked at the experimental helicopter program that had been sitting idle because no one could figure out what to do with machines this fragile, and had a terrible idea. Major Jack Brennan had flown P-51 Mustangs over France. Fighters made sense: speed, firepower, altitude. You outflew the enemy or you outgunned them. Helicopters made no sense. In a fighter, you controlled the aircraft through the wings. In a helicopter, you controlled it through rotor blades that were simultaneously providing lift, propulsion, and directional control. Every input on the controls required compensating for 3 other forces trying to tear the machine in different directions. Forward flight was achieved by tilting the entire rotor disc, that 38-foot circle of spinning blades above your head, in the direction you wanted to travel. But tilting the rotor disc meant unbalancing the lift, which meant adjusting the collective pitch, the angle of attack on every blade simultaneously, which changed the engine load, which changed the rotor speed, which required adjusting the throttle, which changed the torque, which meant the tail rotor had to compensate, or the entire machine would spin like a top. You flew a helicopter by coordinating both hands, both feet, and your brain in a ballet of adjustments that had to happen faster than conscious thought. Brennan had 60 hours in the R-5. That made him one of the 10 most experienced helicopter pilots in the Mediterranean theater. The briefing had been blunt. 6 men, 12,000 feet, Austrian Alps. Weather window closes in 4 hours. Gestapo patrol inbound. Sir, Brennan had said, looking at the intelligence officer with the kind of expression you give someone who's just suggested flying to the moon. The R-5's certified ceiling is 14,000 feet, but that's in ideal conditions. The air density at 12,000 is going to cut our engine performance by 30%. We're talking about an aircraft with a Warner Super Scarabee radial engine that produces 180 horsepower. Most fighter aircraft engine starters have more power than that. The intelligence officer hadn't blinked. Can it be done? Brennan had thought about Carter Harmon in Burma, about the impossible rescue everyone said couldn't happen. Maybe, he'd said, if everything goes perfectly. It won't. I know. The R-5 lifted off from the forward base at 1400 hours. The machine was lightly loaded, half fuel, minimal equipment, just Brennan and his co-pilot, Lieutenant Mike Costello. They needed every pound of performance they could squeeze out of the airframe. The flight north was smooth for the first 30 minutes. Alpine foothills, gradually rising terrain, the sun bright and the air crystalline. Then they hit the mountain. Imagine flying into a maze where the walls are 3,000 feet tall and made of rock, where the corridors twist without warning, where the wind doesn't blow horizontally, it boils, churning in vertical rivers of air that can slam an aircraft into the ground or throw it 1,000 feet skyward in seconds. The R-5 entered a valley and the world became violence. An updraft caught the helicopter and threw it 200 feet higher in 3 seconds. Brennan's stomach lurched. His hands moved automatically, cyclic forward to counter the climb, collective down to reduce pitch, pedals adjusting to compensate for the yaw. The rotor RPM surged. The engine screamed. Then they hit the downdraft on the other side of the valley. The helicopter dropped like a stone. The rotor blades suddenly unloaded, spun faster. The engine, no longer pulling hard, raced. Brennan pulled collective, increasing the blade angle, loading the rotor system back up. The machine shook so hard his vision blurred. What the hell was that? Costello's voice was tight on the intercom. Rotor stall. We just hit the edge of it. A rotor stall was what happened when the airflow over the spinning blades became turbulent, when the smooth lifting force became chaos, when the helicopter stopped flying and started falling with style. Duh. It was the thing rotary wing pilots feared most. And in these mountains, it was waiting around every corner. The fuel gauge showed 40 minutes remaining. The map showed they were still 20 minutes from the target. Brennan did the math in his head, 20 minutes in, maybe 10 minutes on the ground and 20 minutes back. That was 50 minutes. He had 40. We're cutting it close, Costello said quietly. We're cutting it non-existent, Brennan replied. Start looking for emergency landing sites. We might be walking out of here. They flew deeper into the Alps. The valleys narrowed, the peaks pressed closer. The helicopter was a tiny mechanical insect threading between teeth of stone. At 11,500 feet, the engine note changed. Not dramatically, just a subtle shift in pitch, a hesitation in the rhythm. Brennan's hand moved to the throttle, enriching the fuel mixture. At this altitude, the air was thin enough that combustion became marginal. Too much fuel and the engine would flood. Too little and it would starve. There was a sweet spot, maybe a millimeter wide, on the throttle control. He found it by feel. The engine smoothed out. For now. Target ahead, Costello said, pointing through the canopy. The glacier emerged from behind a ridgeline like a frozen highway, tilted at 40 degrees, white ice streaked with gray rock. Crevasses cutting across the surface like wounds. And they're small as ants from this distance, the figures, 4 of them in one group. 2 more, separated higher on the slope. Angel 1 to Green Up survivors, I have visual on 6 personnel. Confirm you have 6 souls requiring extraction. The radio crackled. Confirmed, Angel 1, 6 souls, be advised, we have wounded. 1 compound fracture, 1 can't walk without support. Gestapo patrol approximately 3 kilometers down valley, estimated 30 minutes from our position. 30 minutes. Brennan looked at the landing zone. The glacier was steep, crevasses everywhere. The surface conditions unknown, could be hard ice, could be soft snow that would swallow the helicopter's landing gear. He looked at the fuel gauge. 18 minutes. He looked at the weight calculation in his head. 6 men, 1,400 pounds minimum. The R-5 could maybe, possibly, hypothetically lift 1,100 pounds total in these conditions. 300 pounds overweight. That was a 50% reduction in engine power, a 50% reduction in rotor efficiency, a 50% chance the helicopter wouldn't be able to hover during takeoff and would simply slide sideways down the glacier until it hit a crevasse and tumbled. Mike, Brennan said quietly, I need you to make a choice. Costello turned in his seat. Those 6 men down there are 1,400 pounds. This helicopter can lift maybe 1,100, which means someone has to stay behind. Either you stay here and I make the extraction alone, which gives us a better weight margin, or you come with me and one of those men stays on the glacier and waits for the Gestapo. The silence stretched. Then Costello unstrapped his harness. They'll need someone who can shoot if the Germans show up early. You'll need the weight margin for the wounded. They landed on a relatively flat section of glacier 300 yards below the stranded team. The helicopter settled onto the ice with a grinding crunch. The rotor wash, that hurricane of downward thrust from the spinning blades, threw up a cloud of snow and ice crystals that turned the world white. Brennan kept the rotor turning, kept the engine running. Every second on the ground was fuel burned for nothing. Costello jumped out, his boots crunching on the ice. He grabbed his rifle, a medical kit, his sidearm, gave Brennan a salute that looked more like a wave goodbye. Then he was running toward the stranded agents. Brennan sat alone in the helicopter, watching the fuel gauge tick down. 16 minutes. The numbers didn't work. But numbers never worked. Not in Burma when Carter Harmon rescued those men. Not anywhere helicopters were asked to do impossible things. You flew the machine until it couldn't fly anymore, and then you flew it a little further. The first 4 men reached the helicopter at a stumbling run. Brennan could see them through the bubble canopy, gaunt faces, frost-burned skin, eyes too bright with exhaustion and adrenaline. One was being supported by 2 others, his legs splintered with ski poles and parachute cord. They piled into the cabin behind him. The helicopter sagged on its landing gear. The rotor RPM dropped 5 revolutions. Brennan adjusted the collective, increasing blade pitch to compensate. The engine note rose, the fuel consumption ticked higher. 14 minutes remaining. "Where are the other 2?" he shouted over the rotor noise. One of the men, an OSS lieutenant with a Boston accent and hands shaking from cold, pointed up the glacier. "Phillips and Torres, 200 yards. Phillips is carrying him. Torres took a round in the leg 3 days ago, infected." Through the canopy, Brennan could see them now, 2 figures, moving with the agonizing slowness of men at the absolute end of their endurance. And behind them, further down the valley, Obermann. "Vehicle, the Gestapo patrol." "How long until they're in rifle range?" Brennan asked. 10 minutes, maybe less." Costello's voice crackled over the radio. He'd made it to the 2 stragglers, was with them now. "Angel 1, Torres can't walk. We're going to have to carry him. 5 minutes to reach your position." Brennan looked at the fuel gauge. 13 minutes. Looked at the weight calculation. 6 men at 1,400 pounds. The helicopter's maximum lift capacity at this altitude was maybe 1,100 on a good day with favorable winds. He was 300 pounds over. And that was before accounting for the wounded man who couldn't support his own weight, who would shift and unbalance the center of gravity during takeoff. The math was screaming at him. Leave someone behind. Leave 1 man and the numbers work. Leave 2 men and you have a safety margin. But which one do you leave? The intelligence officer with the photographic memory, who'd mapped every German position within 50 miles. The radio operator who was the only person who knew the encryption keys to contact Allied command. The wounded engineer who'd spent 3 days crawling across a glacier rather than slow down his team. The pilots who jumped into enemy territory, knowing they might never get out. Brennan thought about why helicopters existed. Not to fight, not to bomb, not to strafe. To reach the unreachable, to save the unsavable. To land in places no airplane could go and bring people home who would otherwise die. If you left someone behind, the machine worked. But the mission, the real mission, the one that wasn't written in the briefing document, failed. He keyed the radio. "Costello, get them here. All of them. We're taking everyone." "Jack, the weight." "I know the weight. I know the math. Get them here." The rotor turned overhead, that hypnotic thump, thump, thump that was either the sound of salvation or the countdown to a crash. The 2 men and Costello arrived at a shambling run-crawl-drag. Torres was gray-faced, his lips blue. Phillips looked like a skeleton. They loaded into the cabin. The helicopter's landing gear groaned. The entire airframe sank 2 inches deeper into the snow. 7 people, 1,500 pounds, 400 pounds over maximum. The rotor RPM dropped to 255. The specifications called for 270. The engine was screaming, but it couldn't pull hard enough to maintain the rated speed under this load. Brennan felt the machine settle, felt it become heavy, felt it transform from aircraft into tomb. 11 minutes of fuel, 38 minutes to safety. Down the valley, the Gestapo vehicles were close enough that he could see individual figures emerging. Rifles, maybe a machine gun. "Hold on," Brennan said to the men behind him. He pulled collective. The engine note changed from scream to shriek. The rotor blades bit the thin air, trying to generate lift from atmosphere that barely existed at 12,000 feet. Didn't lift, and added more collective. The rotor RPM dropped further, 250, 245, the edge of retreating blade stall. If the RPM dropped below 240, the rotor system would lose efficiency so catastrophically that the helicopter would fall out of the sky, even with the engine at full power. He was 15 RPM from disaster. The landing gear broke free of the snow. The helicopter lurched upward 6 inches, then stopped, hovering in ground effect. That cushion of compressed air trapped between the spinning rotor disc and the surface that gave a few precious percentage points of extra lift. But ground effect only worked within 1 rotor diameter of the surface. Once he climbed higher than 38 feet, that cushion would disappear. And he needed to climb to 60 feet just to clear the crevasses ahead. The machine hung there, balanced on a knife edge. Too heavy to climb, too committed to land. Brennan remembered something from his early training, a half-forgotten lecture about helicopter performance. Translational lift. When a helicopter transitioned from hover to forward flight, the rotor blades encountered fresh, undisturbed air instead of recirculating their own downwash. That transition, usually around 20 knots forward speed, gave you an extra margin of efficiency, maybe 10% more lift. If you could get the machine moving forward, while still in ground effect, the rotor system might become efficient enough to actually climb. It was insane. It required accelerating toward a field of crevasses while hovering 5 feet off the ground in an overloaded helicopter. He pushed the cyclic forward. The rotor disc tilted. The helicopter began translating across glacier. 5 knots, 10 knots. The crevasses were rushing toward them. 15 knots. The rotor efficiency improved. The machine felt lighter. 20 knots. Brennan pulled collective. The helicopter climbed. 10 feet. 20 feet. The rotor RPM was still dropping, but they were moving upward. 30 feet. 40 feet. 50 a crevasse flashed beneath them, a blue-black wound in the white ice. 60 feet. They'd cleared the danger zone. Oh. Behind them, from down the valley, the crack of rifle fire. Bullets stitching through air where the helicopter had been 30 seconds earlier. But they were climbing now, translating forward and up, the machine struggling, but flying, the engine burning fuel at a rate that would empty the tanks in 9 minutes. But for now, for this moment, they were airborne. All 7 of them. In a helicopter that was rated for 3. The impossible had become merely improbable. Which in rotary wing aviation was all you could ever ask for. The flight back was an exercise in controlled desperation. Every minute, Brennan had to make a choice. Maintain altitude and burn more fuel, or descend into denser air where the engine could breathe, but the mountains could reach up and swat them down. Fly the direct route over the highest peaks where the winds could flip them, or take the longer valley path where the Luftwaffe might still have fighters. Every decision had the wrong answer. He chose valleys, chose lower altitude, chose burning fuel he didn't have in exchange for air thick enough to keep the Warner Super Scarab engine running. The men in the back were silent. Not because there was nothing to say, but because talking required oxygen, and at 12,000 feet, they were already rationing every breath. Torres had passed out. Phillips was bracing him, keeping his wounded leg elevated. The intelligence officer was clutching a leather case that Brennan guessed contained whatever intelligence they died to gather. The fuel gauge read 6 minutes. The map said they were still 14 minutes from the emergency strip. "Might," one of the men in back said, the lieutenant with the Boston accent. "We're not going to make it, are we?" Brennan didn't answer immediately. In aviation, there was a concept called fuel to alternate. Every flight plan had a primary destination and a backup. You calculated fuel based on reaching the primary with enough reserve to divert to the alternate if necessary. But this flight hadn't been planned with alternates. There was only one option, the forward strip in Italy, and they weren't going to reach it. "There's a valley," Brennan said, scanning the terrain ahead. "About 8 minutes forward, wide enough to land. We can set down, I'll leave the helicopter there with you men. Hike out to the nearest Allied position, bring back fuel and a recovery team." "How far is the nearest position?" "Maybe 10 miles. "Through what kind of terrain?" Brennan glanced at the map. "German-occupied mountain passes." The silence was answer enough. Setting down meant leaving 7 men, 6 wounded OSS agents, and 1 helicopter pilot in hostile territory, with no transportation and limited weapons. The Gestapo would find them by nightfall. "Keep flying," the lieutenant said. "We've come this far." The fuel gauge read 4 minutes, then 3. At 2 minutes remaining, the engine note changed. Not a failure, not yet, just a hesitation, a microscopic starve as the fuel pump began sucking air from the bottom of the tank. Costello's voice crackled over the radio from somewhere ahead. He'd made it back to the forward strip and was talking to the tower. "Angel One, I've got vehicles with fuel standing by. How's your status?" "Fuel status is critical," Brennan said. "I've got maybe 90 seconds of flying time. You're 6 minutes out." "I know." The engine hiccuped. Once, twice. Brennan enriched the fuel mixture as much as he dared. The Warner radial engine coughed, caught, smoothed out. For now, through the canopy, he could see the valley opening up, the transition from mountains to foothills. The forward strip was down there somewhere, carved into a valley floor. Just a strip of cleared dirt with tents and fuel trucks and men who were supposed to rescue helicopters, not be rescued by them. The engine hiccuped again, lost power for a full second. The rotor RPM dropped. Brennan lowered the collective, reducing the load on the engine, trading altitude for time. They were descending whether he wanted to or not. The fuel gauge read empty. The engine was running on vapor and momentum and whatever guards watched over rotary wing aircraft. 1 minute. 30 seconds. Brennan saw the strip. Tower, I've got visual. I'm coming straight in. No pattern. Fuel emergency. Cleared for immediate landing. Angel 1. Fire trucks are standing by. The helicopter was 300 feet up. 200. The engine quit. Not dramatically. No explosion. No fire. Just a sudden absence of sound. The Warner Super Scarab radial engine stopped turning and became 600 pounds of useless metal. But the rotor was still spinning. Auto-rotation, the one thing that made helicopters different from stones. When the engine quit, the rotor blades could windmill in the airflow, generating just enough lift to control the descent. Not slow it, not stop it, just control it. You fell in a helicopter with a dead engine, but you fell with style. Brennan lowered the collective to flat pitch, allowing the rotor to spin freely. The helicopter descended faster, but the rotor RPM increased to a safe range. 100 feet. He aimed for the strip. 50 feet. The ground was rushing up fast. 20 feet. At 10 feet, Brennan pulled full collective. The rotor blades, spinning fast from the descent, bit the air one final time. The stored energy in the rotating system translated into lift. The helicopter's descent stopped. For just a moment, they hung in the air on momentum alone, then gravity reasserted itself. The landing gear hit the dirt strip. Hard. The helicopter bounced, tilted, nearly rolled. Brennan corrected with the cyclic. The machine settled back down. Rotor still turning, but slowing. Engine silent. Everyone alive. The men in the back sat frozen for a moment. Then someone started laughing. That edge of hysteria sound of people who just lived through something they were supposed to die from. Brennan killed the rotor brake, letting the blades coast to a stop naturally. His hands were shaking. 54 minutes of flight time, fuel capacity, 40 minutes. He'd stretched that Warner Super Scarab engine so far past its limits that by rights they should have fallen out of the sky 20 minutes ago. But helicopters weren't about what should happen. They were about what could happen when you flew the machine past impossible and into insane. The 6 OSS agents were extracted, debriefed, and sent back to rear area hospitals. The intelligence they'd gathered detailed maps of every German defensive position between the Alps and the Brenner Pass, allowed Patton's Third Army to bypass the main defensive line entirely when they entered Austria 4 weeks later. An estimated 8,000 American casualties were avoided. The R-5 helicopter was refueled, inspected, and found to have metal fatigue cracks in the rotor hub. From being operated so far beyond specification, it was grounded permanently. Brennan received a Distinguished Flying Cross. The citation was classified for 48 years, and the mission Operation Green Up Shadow, the helicopter extraction from 12,000 feet in the Austrian Alps, remained one of the most closely guarded secrets of the war. Because if anyone had known that the OSS was using experimental helicopters for covert operations, every German patrol in the Alps would have started carrying anti-aircraft weapons. The advantage would have evaporated, so the mission stayed hidden. The men stayed silent, and the R-5 helicopter that proved rotary wing aircraft could operate in the worst conditions imaginable sat in a hangar in Italy until the war ended, then was quietly scrapped. No museum, no plaque. Just another experimental aircraft that had done something no one believed was possible. In the spring of 1945, there were fewer than 200 military helicopters in existence worldwide. By 1950, during the Korean War, helicopters had become essential to military operation, medical evacuation, troop transport, supply delivery. By Vietnam, entire air cavalry divisions were built around rotary wing aircraft. Today, no military on Earth operates without helicopter. The rescue mission that Jack Brennan flew overloaded by 30%, operating at altitudes that exceeded design specifications and extracting personnel from terrain no fixed-wing aircraft could reach, became the template. It proved 3 critical principles that helicopter pioneers had been trying to demonstrate since Igor Sikorsky first flew the VS-300 in 1939. First, helicopters could operate in environments where physics said aircraft shouldn't exist. The thin air at 12,000 feet, the turbulent mountain winds, the cramped landing zones surrounded by cliffs. Every one of those conditions should have made rotary wing flight impossible. But pilots found ways to push the machines further, to fly at the absolute edge of performance, to use techniques translational lift, ground effect, auto-rotation that turned fundamental limitations into tactical advantages. Second, helicopters changed the calculus of what was survivable. Before rotary wing aircraft, being stranded behind enemy lines in mountainous terrain meant death. You couldn't walk out, you couldn't hide, you couldn't call in a rescue because no airplane could land in a glacier field surrounded by peaks. After helicopters, those same impossible situations became difficult extraction. Not easy, not safe, but possible. And possible meant people who would have died got to live. Third, experimental technology forced into combat conditions evolved faster than anything designed in peacetime. The R-4 that Carter Harmon flew in Burma had been experimental, barely tested, prone to mechanical failures. The R-5 that Brennan flew into Austria was still experimental, still unreliable. But each mission taught lessons that were incorporated into the next design. Each failure revealed weaknesses that engineers corrected. Each success expanded the understanding of what helicopters could do. Within 10 years of World War II ending, helicopters had matured from fragile experiments into robust platforms that could operate in combat zones, rescue wounded soldiers, deliver supplies to forward positions, and evacuate refugees from disaster areas. The evolution that should have taken 30 years happened in 10. Because men like Brennan and Harmon and the nameless helicopter pilots who flew missions that were never documented pushed the machines past their breaking point, and sometimes the machines broke. But sometimes they didn't. And those moments when they worked, when an overloaded R-5 climbed out of an Austrian glacier field carrying 7 men who were supposed to die there, those moments proved that helicopters weren't just experimental curiosities. They were the future of aviation. There's a museum in Stratford, Connecticut, the Igor Sikorsky Historical Archive. They have an R-5 helicopter on display, fully restored, painted in wartime colors. The placard describes it as a training aircraft used for experimental flight testing during World War II. It doesn't mention Austria. It doesn't mention Operation Green Up Shadow. It doesn't mention the 6 OSS agents or the overloaded takeoff or the flight that should have ended in a crash. It's because for 48 years that mission was classified. By the time it was declassified, most of the participants had passed away. The helicopter had been scrapped. The documentation was scattered across 3 different archives. And the story, the impossible helicopter rescue from the Austrian Alps that proved rotary wing aircraft could change warfare, had become a footnote in classified documents that almost no one read. But the legacy survived. Every time a search and rescue helicopter pulls a stranded hiker off a mountain, every time a medical helicopter lands on a highway to evacuate crash victims, every time a military helicopter extracts soldiers from hostile territory. That's the legacy of the men who flew experimental aircraft into impossible situations during World War II. They didn't know if the machines would work. They didn't know if the mission would succeed. They only knew that people needed help, and helicopters, those fragile, unreliable, barely functional machines, were the only option. So they started the engine, pulled collective, and lifted into air so thin that physics said flight was impossible. And sometimes, just often enough, they proved physics wrong. That R-5 helicopter in Stratford, Connecticut, it might have been the one Brennan flew, or it might have been a different airframe. The records aren't clear. But somewhere in its rotor hub, there might still be hairline cracks from being operated 400 pounds over maximum weight at 12,000 feet in the Austrian Alps. Metal memory of the day rotary wing aviation stopped being experimental and became essential. The day helicopters proved they could save lives no other aircraft could reach. The day 6 men who were supposed to die in the Alps came home instead. All because one pilot looked at impossible mission parameters and said, "We'll take everyone." While Operation Green Up was a real OSS mission in Austria, February 1945, the helicopter extraction described in this documentary is a dramatized scenario based on documented R-4 and R-5 and known helicopter operations during WW2. The R-5 specifications, performance characteristics, and operational limitations are historically accurate. The Burma rescue by Lieutenant Carter Harmon in April 1944 is a documented historical event.